Today, special treat. We have Angus Duncan, who is the president and CEO of the Bonneville Environmental Foundation since its formation in 1998. He has been pivotally involved in renewable energy and climate policy for probably upwards of 3 decades, and has done some of the really, really heavy lifting in terms of leading Oregon. He chairs the State of Oregon Global Warming Commission. He helped create the West Coast Governor's Global Warming Initiative. He represented Oregon on the Northwest Power Planning Council for 6 years, and he chaired the drafting committee that wrote Oregon's climate change strategy for Kulingoski. He has been in the thick, rolling up his sleeves, making us a strong leader around a lot of these issues. He has also worked for the Department of Energy Policy at the U.S. Department of Transportation. He has taught at the university level, appears regularly at professional conferences and events like this, and it is always a pleasure to have Angus, who will, again, connect some of the dots between here, out there, and I'm sure he can also address how, even though our newspaper says it's not a local issue, how climate change is indeed a local issue. So let's give Angus a hand.
Thank you. And a hand. Thanks very much. I assume you can hear me and I'm not squawking through the feedback loops, and if so, just raise your hand or fling something pointed and heavy at me, or just let me know. Well, I'm very glad to be here. I'm very glad that I am preceding Bill McKibben and not following him. He's a very hard act to follow. So we'll try to at least create some of the local context for the more global view that Bill will undoubtedly give you, and say hello for me. I need to make apologies in advance because this subject is a subject that almost doesn't have a place to logically end. Greenhouse gases, climate change, energy use, energy efficiency, these are all elements that touch all of our lives and touch it almost every time we turn around, from the moment we wake up in the morning, because the alarm clock goes off, to the moment we finally fall asleep at night. So there's almost no place to start and to end, which won't keep us from making the effort at least to start. And if I can't cover everything, and undoubtedly I will not, let's hope we leave some time at the end for some questions. I'm going to try to be reasonably systematic here. Talk first about where Oregon is today on its goals, its trajectory for reducing greenhouse gases, where federal activities supplement or complement our efforts, and we try to complement theirs, because this is a subject that has to be addressed at federal, state, local, global, home residence levels, all of those. We got in this pickle, sort of 1 pound of greenhouse gas emissions at a time, and the only way we get out of it is reducing it, 1 pound at a time. I will talk a little bit about the President's Clean Power Plan, which was very much in the news this week, as I'm sure you're aware. And then I will try to talk about the measures in Oregon to try to move our needle forward, particularly a bill that I helped to write that is now in the Oregon legislature, just passed out of the House Energy and Environment Committee by a vote yesterday. If we had time, we could talk a little bit about how these efforts here and at a federal level fit into global greenhouse gas emissions, the sort of beyond Paris discussion. We probably won't, but again, if you're interested, please raise those questions. We will not talk about an entire sort of 50% of this issue, which is how do we prepare for the climate change and the global warming that's already baked into our energy and environment and atmospheric system, and which will have huge implications for Oregon. The only thing I will say about that today is, good news, it's raining. Bad news, it's probably going to hit 60 degrees today, which means lots of rain, and precious little snow. And if you don't understand what I mean by that, that's a good question to ask as well. So let's start charging through, also with apologies. If I race too fast, try to grab hold of a question and ask it to me at the end, because I probably will. So this is the Commission's, I think, fourth report to the legislature. That is our job. We were set up by Governor Kulongoski in the legislature back in 2007. We were given vast responsibility to look at climate change and its impacts and ways to reduce greenhouse gases, in every sector of the Oregon economy. We were unfortunately given no authority, no budget, and no staff with which to carry out those responsibilities, which says a lot about generally how we deal with an issue like this in this country. Even when we acknowledge it's an issue that always seems to be something that's over the horizon, and we have too many immediate issues that tend to drive it off the stage. Look at any poll of what people think is most important to them in this current election, and if climate change even makes the list at 10th place, we feel pretty good about it. So my commission submitted a report to the legislature earlier this year. We tracked how we were doing on emissions, what more we needed to do. We proposed a new greenhouse gas intermediate reduction goal at 2035, since we have a big gap between the adopted ones at 2020 and 2050. And we described a pathway forward, an illustrative pathway whereby Oregon could get to its greenhouse gas goals in 2035 and 2050. And the bill in the legislature at least has the potential for getting us there in one very large sector of our economy. So, back when we first started this process under Governor Kulongoski in 2004, what we thought we saw, do I have a point and aimer on this thing? Probably not. Anyway, so what we saw was that curve you see up there. We saw emissions since 1990 rising at about 1% to 2% a year in Oregon. And when we projected forward, looking at demographics and economics, we saw emissions continuing to rise as far as the eye could see. And that's what the governor gave us as our task, to figure out how we bend that line back downwards, and bend it back downwards far enough that at least Oregon is doing its part by way of reducing its contribution to global greenhouse gases. In fact, with actions we had already taken before we even started to work, but we didn't know because we didn't have the data, and a number of actions since then, we've managed to achieve our 2010 goal, which was adopted by the legislature, and which said, by 2010, take that upward bending line, at least flatten it, and try to bend it back downwards, even a little bit. Our 2020 goal was to be back below our 1990 level, there over on the left, by at least 10%. And our 2050 goal was to be below that level, 1990 level, by at least 75%. So how have we been doing so far? Well, we do really good energy efficiency work in this state and in this region. And it's because we have both a commitment to it and a lot of effective programs, and we're continually retooling those to make them more effective, to pull in more ways of bringing energy consumption down. Every time there's a national poll that says what are the best states on energy efficiency in the country, it's always Oregon, Washington, and 8 states with power costs that are 2 to 3 times what ours are. They have good programs too, but they also have a real immediate price incentive to get their power consumption down. We have cheaper power rates, but we have better programs, and it shows. We add in, there we go, we add in Oregon's renewable portfolio standard that is supposed to get us to 25% new renewable energy serving Oregon loads by 2025. Add that to our existing base of hydropower, and that gets us up to probably between half and 2/3 of our electricity by 2025 coming from renewable resources, and therefore, essentially zero carbon resources. We also negotiated back in 2010 a deal with Portland General Electric whereby instead of spending $500 million to retrofit the Boardman coal plant, only coal plant in Oregon, and then running it for another 20 years, we proposed as an alternative putting a tenth of that, about $50 million, into retrofits that would allow it to run to 2020, and PGE then agreed that in 2020 it would stop coal combustion at Boardman. No more coal will be burned there after 2020. It was a good deal for Oregon. It's a significant chunk, although as you see, when you put it in the context of our overall greenhouse gas emissions, every action, sort of big like Boardman or little like taking the bus today instead of driving your car, has an incremental effect, and you have to add a lot of this stuff together to get where you need to go. When you add those together with a bill that the legislature finally made permanent last year, the low carbon fuel standard, which is supposed to drive greenhouse gas emissions from our vehicles down by 10% by 2020 or 2025, that's where the line goes. So good news is, our greenhouse gas emissions are actually declining. Bad news is that's the line on which they should be declining, and they're not. So we've got a big wedge, a big chunk of greenhouse gas emissions that we still have to work on. And the other thing we know is that there is always upward pressure from demographics, from population growth, and from getting more gadgets that we can plug in at home. So that's always pushing the line upward. Our programs have to push the line downward, and our energy efficiency. So this is just another look at this. We actually have taken the dates down, numbers now down to 2013, and I hope to have 2014 soon. Another problem is our data are consistently out of date. But as you can see, we're continuing to push the line down, and it's particularly significant that we started pushing that line down in 1999. And so while from 2008 or so, you can see the impacts of recession. Recession tends to push energy consumption down. We've kept pushing that energy consumption down even as we've emerged out of the recession. But so now we're starting from a lower line, but we still have those demographics and the technology pushing the line back upward. So we've still got a big gap. This, just by way of point of, I'm sorry, I want to show you one more thing on that. It's also, I think, noteworthy that in 1990, our emissions were 56.9 million tons. Sorry, it should be million tons. In 2013, we were back under 60 million tons from a peak of close to 70. So we're not quite back to 1990 levels, still less to 10% below where we should be in 4 years, but we're at least within conversational distance of our 2020 goal. By contrast, if you look at the country as a whole, you can see that they peaked 10 years later than Oregon did, and their peak and their drop is largely a function of the recession. And the concern, of course, is that once you get out of the recession, you start going sideways and potentially back up again. And so, all of the work that we do in Oregon can be undone in the rest of the country. So it's not just us, it's getting the rest of the country, it's getting national policy and state-by-state policy and city-by-city policy all to complement each other. Here's another numerical look at this. The top number is just the number I just showed you, although that's the 2012 number, 2013 is lower. You look at it on a per capita basis, person by person, and we actually have dropped significantly on a per capita basis from, we've dropped by about 25% since 1990 on a per capita basis. If you just look at the Portland-Multnomah County area, we've actually dropped close to 30 or 35% on a per capita basis. Again, we need to do better than that, and the rest of the country needs to start emulating us. And when we have population inflow at the same time, we're pushing per capita emissions down. Those two tend to counteract each other, so we have to push down even harder. But it's in the cities where that energy efficiency is available, and that's why you do better in Portland and Multnomah County than we do as a state overall. if you look at it on a per gross domestic product basis, basically the money and value that we generate on a year-to-year basis, we're also doing really well. Our GDP rose in the last 20 years from $65 billion to $205 billion. You know, our greenhouse gas emissions per $1 million of GDP dropped by almost, what is that, about 2/3, about 65%. So we are able to prove that you can have a prosperous, you know, working economy generating jobs and still push greenhouse gas emissions down. You know, energy consumption and economic development used to be marching in step. Now they're marching in completely different directions. And that's really good news too. I'm going to skip consumption base because I got to start skipping something. This is another way of looking at our emissions, and this is important because you can see in the sort of upper left-hand 3 wedges, you know, those are not insignificant emissions, but when you look at transportation and you look just at electricity use, you can see that by themselves, that's 2/3 of our emissions. And if you cut out of that transportation sector just the cars and light trucks, not the over-the-road trucks, not the rail, not the air, just things that you and I drive on a day-to-day basis, that's 25% of Oregon's greenhouse gas emissions. If you look at the utility sector, the electricity sector, and you just cut out the emissions associated with just the coal generation that feeds our electricity, you know, we get about 1/3 of our electricity from coal, but we get almost 1/4 of our overall statewide greenhouse gas emissions from that coal. Almost all of that coal is burned outside the state and brought in over the wire. It's what we call coal by wire. And getting at coal plants that are not in our state is a lot harder than getting at the Boardman project. So if you want to know where to start to work on greenhouse gas emissions, you know, we have recommended as a commission to the state that, you know, we do kind of the John Dillinger answer when he was asked why he robbed banks. He said, because that's where the money is. Well, this is where the greenhouse gas emissions are. So these are our 2 primary targets. That's the Boardman coal plant, 585 megawatts of coal burning capacity, only coal plant in the state of Oregon. As I told you, we negotiated a deal that ended up saving PGE ratepayers, that's probably most of you in this room, about $500 million in avoided retrofits by closing this plant down. You know, it still leaves an open question, well, what do you replace this with, and will what you replace it with cost more than that? When we and PGE and the Public Utility Commission did the analysis, we concluded that this deal overall, even with replacement power, would save Portland General ratepayers money. So that's a significant chunk of coal, but there's a lot more coal out there that's feeding into Oregon. So even though we're closing the Boardman plant, and the state of Washington followed us and closed an even larger facility, the only coal plant in the state of Washington, but both of our states get power from most of this sort of arc of power plants in the Intermountain West, the Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, Nevada, down to Arizona plants. Most of these are Pacific Power plants, and they feed loads all over the West, including a significant chunk of Oregon's load. They're much harder to get at, of course, because we don't have state regulatory reaches into those states. Those states manage the operations of those plants. So getting at those requires using a federal leverage as well as state leverage. Here's another look at our 2 utilities. Up above is Portland General Electric. You can see where the Boardman plant closes down, but you can also see that if you simply follow the plans Portland General has, which right now are to replace coal with natural gas. Natural gas produces about half as many greenhouse gas emissions, but if you're increasing population and you're generating more kilowatt hours with a new gas plant than the old coal plant, they tend to balance each other out and cancel each other out. And so PGE's emissions go sideways. Don't go up, that's good. Don't go down anywhere near the trajectory they need to be on. You can see Pacific Power, same thing. They have some closures scheduled in the 2020s, but immediately after that, their emissions start going back up as well. So we have to get at what we do, not just with the existing coal plants, but with the two utilities replacement resource strategies. Here are the cars. And as you can see, the shaded lines are the emissions, and then I've overlaid a line showing our vehicle miles traveled, how far collectively we drive our cars and trucks. The semi-orange, kind of dirty orange-brown, nasty-looking color at the bottom there, right? That's gasoline, and I don't know why we put a cleaner color in there for diesel, because it's dirtier. But we did. And as you can see, our emissions for vehicles have managed to stay pretty stable. They peaked in, about 2007 or 8. They dropped also with the recession. But interestingly, our vehicle miles traveled, while they went up through about the same period of time, have been going down ever since and continue to go down even with the ending of the recession. And what we don't show there, but which is also a factor, is the vehicles that we drive now are more fuel efficient on average. We're getting cleaner cars out of Detroit, out of Japan, out of wherever they come from. And that's showing up in the emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions as well. So as you see, there's a little peak, a little bump at the very end of this, but that bump comes from diesel. That's from over the road, the big trucks, regaining their economic activity. The cars and trucks continue to be stable, and light trucks continue to be stable or declining. But to get to where we need to go, we have to basically do a lot more than we're doing on cars and trucks. We did an analysis within the state, in this case using the Department of Transportation's money since I didn't have any. And we did a pretty good analysis that said, if we do all of these things on the left, we get down by 2050 to about 63% below 1990 levels. That's still short of our 75% goal. So we ran another set of numbers that amped up the measures that we would do. And we got down a little further, and then we tried two more options. One, bumping up, in effect, the price of driving, and therefore reducing the amount of driving that people would do, or assuming an even greater technological bump up. And the most important part of this otherwise far too complex and confusing chart is the one I put the arrow on. We need by 2050 to have a fleet that is at least 50% electric vehicle or comparably low carbon. And we need to be plugging those electric vehicles not into the sides of coal plants, but into wind turbines and solar panels. We need a much cleaner electricity system, or we can't meet our transportation goals. A bunch of other things in there. If there are parts of that you can ask me about, but that'd be probably an hour's discussion all by itself. This reinforces the point that I just made. I just went out and took a look at different power systems around the country, trying to get ones that were comparable to what we deal with in Oregon. So in Wichita, Kansas, they are predominantly coal with a little bit of gas. If you convert that to a greenhouse gas sort of comparable miles per gallon, how efficient a gasoline vehicle would have to be to equal the electric vehicle in that same area. Well, if you're driving an electric vehicle in Wichita, Kansas, you get the equivalent of driving about a 35 mile per gallon automobile. I mean, that's a lot of coal, but electric vehicles are highly efficient. And so you do pretty well, but you can buy a gas-powered vehicle and get 35 miles to the gallon today easily. If you go to Raleigh, North Carolina, about half coal and a growing chunk of gas, but much less coal. then you're getting the miles per gallon carbon equivalent of a car that gets about 55 miles per gallon. That's really good. And that's approximately where the President's and the EPA's vehicle fuel economy standards are supposed to get us to by 2025. But it's not good enough. We have to do much better than that. We have to do something a lot closer to where Seattle is. Seattle has a little bit of coal that they import from all those plants in the Mountain West, but they have a lot of hydro. Hydro's essentially zero carbon, so they're getting significantly greater than 100 miles per gallon carbon equivalent. You look at our utilities in Oregon. Pacific Core looks a lot like Wichita, Kansas. PGE, which is most of Portland and the surrounding metropolitan area, looks a lot closer to Raleigh, North Carolina. This is after you take out the Boardman power plant. Eugene, which is predominantly hydro, looks a lot like Seattle and gets about the same emissions of Seattle. We have to get a lot closer to somewhere between PGE and Eugene, but closer to Eugene than PGE. So we did an analysis, what we call a wedge analysis, in this year's report to the legislature. We said, we're inching sideways. What would it take? What combination of measures would we have to take in order to get us on the trajectory toward our 2050 goal? So we looked at transportation efficiency, power generation, waste management, agricultural measures, and we basically pushed them to the limit. In efficiency, for example, we are pushing residential heating, air conditioning, lighting, same thing in commercial, from measures that actually save us money to measures that could cost us as much as $2,000 or $2,500, per ton saved. There aren't very many at that end, needless to say, and we probably wouldn't do very many of those. When we average them out, however, they come to something approximating a minus $1 a ton per ton of carbon saved. If you did all of those energy efficiency measures from the cheapest to the most expensive, they average out almost no cost per ton of carbon saved. We could do it if we chose to. We looked at all of the other ones as well, and I'm going to spare you those. But come back here just briefly. So when we looked at all of those, we were still short of our trajectory, and so we hypothesized putting a carbon tax in that would get us to the rest of the way. All this is illustrative. We could do more programs and no carbon tax. We could do all carbon tax. We could do all carbon cap and trade instead of a carbon tax. But this is a way to try to balance out what each sector would bear and to keep the carbon tax to the minimum we could, and it came to about $60 a ton. Would we rather have a $60 a ton carbon tax than spend $2,500 on an efficiency measure? Yeah, we probably would. Would we rather have a $60 a ton carbon tax than spend an average of minus $1 on an energy efficiency measure? That's the kind of policy trade-off that the legislature has to educate itself sufficiently to make. But in this case, we posited a $60 a ton carbon tax starting at $10 a ton and ramping in about $10 increase every 2 or 3 years to get to where we're going to go. That just gives you an example of the kinds of measures we would have to take. You saw the transportation ones already, especially electric vehicles, to get onto our trajectory. So the recommendations we made to the state, were those. I would like to just address those, second and third to the last bullets. One is we have to reduce in all sectors we already posited, beginning with cars and coals. And secondly, we have to leverage the federal initiatives, in effect, take them and build on them and try to amplify them. And the two principal ones were, first, automobiles, those vehicle fuel economy standards that are supposed to get us to around 55 miles per gallon average fleet fuel economy for light-duty vehicles by 2025. That's a little less than double where we are right now. We're at about 30 or 31 miles per gallon. So it's a big lift in the next 10 years, but all indications are, especially if electric vehicles continue their, run down the runway and their liftoff, technologically, there's no question we can do this. If we amp up our take of electric vehicles, we bring the cost of electric vehicles down, and both the federal and state Department of Transportation analysts say, once we're building electric vehicles at the same volume that we're building internal combustion vehicles, the going-in cost will be about the same. It won't cost you any more to go electric than to go gasoline, but the cost of driving your electric vehicle will be substantially lower than the cost of the internal combustion engine, and the service and repair costs are also substantially lower. It's a real money winner for everybody if we can simply get that lift off. The federal government has also proposed over-the-road fuel economy standards, and just in this last week, there was an international agreement on fuel economy and carbon efficiency standards for international aircraft. The other one, this is the one that was in the news today. Well, in 2014, we got new fuel economy and carbon economy standards for new power plants. Had to do that to get at the existing power plants. The president last year, 2 years ago, proposed standards for existing power plants, particularly, but not exclusively, coal plants. Last summer, that rule became the final rule. And this last week, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a stay of the rule, meaning not that it's invalidated, but that EPA does not have the authority to enforce it until it has worked its way through the D.C. Circuit Court and potentially to the Supreme Court. It's a real wrench in the machinery. I would not kid you. It doesn't spell the end of the Clean Power Plan by any means, but it certainly undermines the progress that we were making federally. It also means that states like Oregon and Washington and California and a number of the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states and several states in the industrial Midwest, all of whom initiated carbon reduction goals and efforts before there was even a Clean Power Plan. Now the load is placed back on them and on us to continue the progress while we wait to see the Clean Power Plan work its way through the courts. If it survives, and the Supreme Court reinforces several preceding decisions that this same court, same makeup, have already made to confirm EPA's authority to regulate carbon from power plants, then it means about a 1/3 reduction by 2030 in the states or in the country's greenhouse gas emissions. Each state gets its own target. There are a number of different ways you can bring your emissions down. Oregon, as you will see, is actually already in compliance with this rule in both its opening gate in 2020 and the closure final goal in 2030. So is Washington, so is California. So we don't have the kind of, if you will, disruption and upheaval and big effort to try to wrench our electric utility systems around to be in compliance with this plan. That's good for us economically. It's good for our industries because they don't get wrenched out of shape. So, whether this happens, whatever happens with the Clean Power Plan, we still have our state goals, so do our neighbors, and so do a number of other states. The final rule basically said these are the average emissions per megawatt hour that we have to reach by 2030. And you can see, Oregon has a significantly lower level it has to reach than, say, Montana, which has a lot more coal that it burns. On the other hand, a lot of the coal that Montana burns is to generate electricity to send to Oregon. So it's a very complicated process because the EPA rules have to be state by state, but the power grid doesn't run state by state. It's a much more complicated multi-state system. And so we're really trying to fit a square peg into a round hole but that's the only law we have since the Congress is not moved to develop something which would be a more efficient way and less costly way of moving emissions down. So another look at where Oregon would be. The red line on the left is where we would have to be if we did it on a tons per megawatt hour basis. And as you can see, I'm sorry, the black line is the EPA line. The red line is where we are already planning to be, even if we didn't do another thing in Oregon between now and 2030. Just continued our current business as usual. We are below the rule when it starts in 2022. We're still below it when it hits its target in 2030. There's another way to look at it, which is one's rate-based, one's mass-based. I'm not going to try to explain the difference, except that the right-hand side says just a total of how many tons you can emit. And once again, especially with getting rid of Boardman, that's that really steep slope on the extreme left-hand side of it. We start out well in compliance with the rule in 2022. We are barely below the rule or not in non-compliance in 2030, and that assumes we do nothing between now and then, but we will. Here's Montana. Again, the rule is the black line. Where they are is the red line on the left. They've got a really steep drop to accomplish. If they're doing it on a mass-based total tons, again, you can see that those 4 big coal plants in Montana, much of the power from those comes to Oregon and Washington. Clearly, at least a couple of them are going to have to close, maybe 3, maybe 4 out of the total 5 big ones that you see there. So they've got a real struggle. So I want to bring this back to Oregon now and talk very briefly how we're doing. Yeah, I'm over. Very briefly about what's going on right now in Oregon. And I just put this up to remind everybody where we are today and where we are when probably most of us in this room graduated from high school, me at least. We were almost an entirely renewable-based, very low-carbon state in 1965. Today, we're about 45% hydro, about a third coal, gas. The coal share is declining. The gas share is increasing. Our emissions are going sideways. And this is, in effect, those 2 PGE Pacific lines you saw earlier combined into one. So you see, combined into one, that's the red line. We just keep going sideways as far as the eye can see, where we should be on that descending line. We have a bill in the legislature right now. And by we, it is a combination of 6 environmental groups, of which I, wearing a different hat, am one of them, and the 2 electric utilities, PGE and Pacific. Starting the 1st of November of last year, we were negotiating 6, 8, 10 hours a day sometime to see if we could come to an agreement for ramping out coal from Oregon's electricity load and ramping in renewables. And we have a bill in the legislature just passed out of the House committee, actually with a bipartisan vote, barely bipartisan, but bipartisan. So at least 1 R in committee voted for it. I think that's a good sign when it gets to the floor. It basically says by 2030, nearly all of the coal serving Oregon loads will be gone. Probably all of it will be gone. PGE has a special set of management and ownership issues with their share of one of those Montana coal plants, but even they agreed that they would have recovered all of their invested capital by 2030. So if we could get them out by 2030, the utility would not leave any stranded costs in Montana that would have to be recovered from us. So we'd have all the coal out of the system by 2030. We would replace it largely with renewables. We would take that 25% renewable portfolio standard, bump it to 50% by 2040. So we're still ramping it in. We are bringing in renewables as we can adjust the system so that they can manage those renewables and convert that wind and solar power into firm energy, so it's there when you flip the light switch in the morning. We will create a low power grid to plug our electric vehicles into, and equally important, our two electric utilities that are predominantly fossil fueled still will have met their share of Oregon's greenhouse gas goals. So the line at the top is the one you just saw. The line at the bottom shows where their emissions would be under this bill. And as you can see, they approximate a little below, a little above until 2030 when they drop like a stone. And they are millions, about what, 4 or 5 million tons below the trajectory in 2030. They start moving back up again, but they're still below in 2035. New renewable step-ups come in 35 and 40 that should bend that line back down again. If this bill passes, our electrical sector should meet our 2050 goals. You've already seen how our vehicle sector could meet the 2050 goals. The two pieces are linked together, and this is how we get to 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions. We still have another 50% to go, so I don't think my commission's going to close up shop, if this bill goes through. But we will feel pretty good about it if it happens. And I think I'm going to close. Well, all right, I'll close with that image. That's the Canyon Creek fire. I was actually over in John Day on Wednesday of this week. We're looking at trying to develop, with different hat on, trying to develop a biomass project over there using burned timber, down timber, timber that needs to be thinned out of the forest because it hasn't been thinned out in natural fire cycles. See if we can develop enough of a biomass project that we can pull fuel out of the forest and potentially refire the Boardman coal plant with biomass. So we could keep operating that plant, but we would operate it as a plant that had approximately 0 carbon emissions when we add all of the pieces together, and would significantly improve forest health in Oregon and Washington because we'd have to pull fuel out of the east sides of the forest from both places. And it wouldn't mean we'd never have another Canyon Creek fire like the one last summer. Wouldn't mean we would never have the kind of smoke in Portland that you all were inhaling last summer, but it would mean we would start building a downward trajectory to those impacts of climate change that otherwise we're going to have to deal with. And I'm going to stop there. And leave the last 55 or 60 slides unshown. So, questions, and I can repeat the question.
Yeah, here you go.
Do you include nuclear power in your forecast for renewable energy?
In Oregon, we do not, and we do not because when we look at the cost per megawatt hour over time of different low or zero carbon resources, nuclear power can't compete on an economic basis. If it could, we would include it. And it's very likely that there are going to be other states in the country that don't have access to the kind of wind and solar resources that we do, where nuclear power will probably be a part of the back-out carbon equation. Sir.
So why did the proportions of hydro change so much through the years to fossils? Didn't we have enough hydropower?
Well, actually, you answered your own question. No, we basically ran out of significant new sites where we could put dams sometime in the 1960s. And the last large dam on the Columbia Snake system, I think, was placed into service in the late 70s, which means they started planning it in the mid-60s. And also in the late 60s, early 70s, the Bonneville Power Administration, which was responsible for most of that hydro, sent a notice out to PGE, Pacific, Puget, the private utility companies that didn't have preference for that power, and said, starting in the mid-1970s, you guys are going to have to come up with your own resources to meet growing load. So the amount of hydro has declined somewhat over the years, in part because we've had to try to redress the balance between how much of that river we're using to generate electricity, how much we're using for irrigation, for commerce, and ultimately how much we are leaving in the river for the fish and the rest of the ecosystem. And I don't think we have redressed that balance yet, so I think the amount of hydropower is still going to go down. There was just a decision announced down in the Klamath Basin that you may have seen that said 4 sort of medium, small dams that Pacific Power had on the Klamath River are going to come out. Not a big hit on the total hydro available to us, but that's pretty much what's been happening over the last 20 or 30 years. Small dams have gone down, big dams have been derated because we need to move water from generating electricity to moving fish.
What effect will upgrading the grid system have on emissions?
Good and somewhat complicated question, so let me narrow it to two pieces. One is there are significant things that we can do to upgrade the efficiency of the existing system, new materials coming on, new kinds of power balancing equipment that is available. Probably more important than that is what changes do we have to make to the grid to accommodate these new variable generation resources like wind and solar. If we're going to convert that variable generation, right, electricity when the wind blows, none when it doesn't, electricity when the sun shines, none when it doesn't, we have to have a number of changes to the electricity system. Most of those have to do with additional storage, since we don't have any more reservoir room. We have to come up with new storage technologies, and we are. Some of it has to do with how we manage the transmission system. So we are, for example, increasingly integrating the Western transmission grid so that when you have a need in one part of the system, you may have you have excess generation in one part of the system, you have excess load in the other part. The grid 5 years or 10 years ago couldn't match those up because we didn't have the connections. So we're building new connections and control systems in so that whenever we have that kind of imbalance, we have ways to move the excess generation to where you need it. That's going to be particularly important for wind and solar. If they're generating more than can be used locally, but there's a need somewhere else, including all the way down in California, Arizona, there'll be ways to increasingly manage that balance. And finally, we're going to have to move generation from east to west. You saw those coal plants in that arc in the Rocky Mountains. That's also where most of the wind generation is going to come from, because the wind in Montana and the Dakotas, if you've never spent any time there, is very strong and very steady. And we have to have transmission capacity to move it from where the wind is to where the loads are on the I-5 corridor. But if we're closing down coal plants out there, then we are also opening up generation. And while there still has to be adjustment, we can make use of that existing generation to move wind and sun and stored energy from where it's generated to where it can be used.
How much are you working with the Department of Transportation in your analysis on the vehicle usage? I ride public transportation, and from 3:30 till 6:30, it's almost gridlock. And you can wait on one bus for 20 minutes to get 5 blocks because of the car traffic. So if you're increasing the vehicles because of electrical vehicles, and they're all on the road, they're still going to block everything under the sun. And so it's, are these kinds of trade-offs being considered too, with the effect of population increase?
Yes.
And car usage?
Yeah,
and
no.
an inadequate public transportation system? Even though Portland's great,
Yeah.
it has a
It's
lot
not great
to be
enough, yeah.
desired. It's
Yeah.
not good enough if you really depend on it.
No, in fact, we have some real concerns that electric vehicles, particularly because of their cost per mile of driving, are not only going to, potentially add to congestion, but they will also put pressure on our land use planning system. They will put pressure on the urban growth boundary. If it costs as little, if it costs, a tenth as much to drive a mile in an electric car as in a gas car, then people do trade-offs of time and cost, And the impulse will be, to move out to Silverton because it's cheap to drive all the way into Portland. So we have both of those trade-off issues that we have to deal with. And so yes, we are looking really hard at a couple of things. One is density, something nobody in Oregon and nobody in Portland ever likes to talk about. But the fact is that the only way you get bus lines that come, much closer to paying for themselves is if they run in dense enough corridors. That means more multifamily housing in those transit corridors, for the trains and for the buses. And if you have more population in those corridors, it means you can afford more buses or trains. It means they come more often. It means more people will use them, which will in turn, it's basically a virtuous circle if you make it work that way. The other thing we're looking at is sort of all of those transportation modes in between, transit, bus and train on the one hand, and your car on the other. So that's, Lyft and Glimph and Blurb and, and Car2Go and all of the sort of different ways that people can move around without necessarily either getting in their car or having to wait for a bus. If the bus is convenient, you can do it. If it's not, then you drive your car right now because you don't have any choices in the middle. So we're trying to see what it would take to develop those choices in the middle. And then the one other dimension of this I just want to observe is we are really concerned in both the electrical sector and the transportation sector about the potential regressive nature of the solutions. If a low carbon vehicle today, is within my reach or maybe yours, but it's not within the reach of low income folks, and they're living out in East Multnomah County, and their job is in Washington County, and it's 3 bus transfers to get out there, and it takes them an hour. And that's really hard on a low-income household. Same thing with sort of the front-end costs of many of the renewable resources. They're way cheaper to run, but they are more expensive to put in. Average it out, and it ends up being a low-cost source of electricity. But if you have to pay for it up front, it becomes significantly higher cost. Energy efficiency in their homes, that's an upfront capital cost for them. Most of them can't afford it. If they live in rental housing, they don't have the right to do it anyway. And if they do it, they may not get the advantage of it. So there are all of these low-income trade-offs that we have to deal with at the same time we're trying to drive carbon down. The worst thing for low-income households is we don't succeed in driving carbon down, however. Sir.
It seems to me one of the things that has changed in the 50 years since 1965 is that most of the power that supplied Oregon and Washington, which I assume Washington too was at the time used mostly hydropower, which is renewable, is that most of the power was domestically produced, in other words, within the state. As the demand grew faster than the resources available, in other words, the dams could only put out so much, more and more power was purchased from out of state. And as one of your charts showed, a lot of the power that's purchased from other western states is coal produced. So if our local utilities is meeting demand by purchasing out-of-state power, it seems to me it doesn't have much control over how that power is generated or what the greenhouse gas emissions are as a result of that. So is there some way of controlling that?
So most of those power plants you saw out there are owned by a utility or sometimes a consortium of utilities. So those coal strip plants, for example, are owned in Montana, are owned partly by Puget Energy in Seattle, partly by Portland General Electric and Pacific Power here in Oregon. Pacific Power, of course, has loads all over the West, so it's using that electricity to meet a lot of its different loads. So on the one hand, we're importing it from another state. On the other hand, our utilities own that generation. So it's not as though they're buying it from a seller. They own it and generate it and sell it. So they control those systems. What they don't necessarily control is their ability to ramp out of those systems because any change in rates has to go through a public utility commission. So PGE only has to go through one, the one here in Oregon. But Pacific Power has 6 different public utility commissions it has to negotiate with, and that makes its life a lot more complicated. And then apart from the utility commissions, each one of those plants gets permitted in the state it's in, so all of the emissions from that coal strip plant, for example, are regulated by the state of Montana. It's a complex structure, which means ramping out of coal is at least as complicated as ramping into it was. And then it gets mixed with politics. And so you can imagine how difficult it is. So that the bill I mentioned that's in the legislature, it will obligate the utilities to ramp out, to stop delivering coal to Oregon, but it can't obligate Pacific Power to shut down its plants. Pacific Power can conceivably take those plants and redirect that energy somewhere else, to Salt Lake City, to where it has other loads. So that's the puzzle that we have to try to unscramble. It's the reason why we can't shut down the imports in 2030, because PGE has some reciprocal ownership obligations to other owners of that power plant in Montana. Not sure I can make it less complicated for you than that, but that really is the issue. We do have control over our own fate as far as how much coal is in our electricity. We can't necessarily ensure that when we stop taking that coal generation, it won't go somewhere else.
What can we do?
Say again.
What can we do?
Two things, and you really have to do both of them because either by itself does not suffice. So one of the things you have to do is decarbonize your own life as much as possible. That means, and usually these are things that also save you money, but that means weatherizing your house. That means if you've got an old water heater, put in a new one that's a lot more efficient. If you've got a refrigerator that's more than about 5 or 6 years old, I know it seems absurd because it's running well, but the new refrigerators are so much more efficient that you save energy, you save money, and you save carbon by doing them. You can take out your incandescents, put them in a box somewhere just in case, but replace them all with LEDs, which now are almost as inexpensive as incandescents, give better light, and last 20 times. There are all of those things that you can do, and I need to mention, apropos of your question, figure out if there's a way to get from point A to point B without getting in your car. I mean, sometimes there isn't, and that's why we have cars and we ought to drive them. If you've got a commute and you can move from a gas car or diesel to an electric car and carry that front-end cost, do it, because it's going to be a lot easier. And the electrics are getting better and better. The range is getting longer and longer. And here's a little clue. If you don't want to pay $30,000 for a new one, go on Craigslist and look, because you can get a relatively low mileage electric vehicle for about $10,000 to $15,000 right now. It'll be a bargain. So you got to do all of those things, and each one of us has to do them. Entities like the Energy Trust make it easier for us to do them. Tap into the Energy Trust. The big things are you got to let your legislators and your congressmen know that they need to move the button on public policy. If all of us made our homes just as efficient as possible, we'd be a little bit like the guy in the electric vehicle plugging it into the coal plant. Not good enough. So I would encourage anybody who wants to have an effect this week to figure out who your legislator is, call them and say, House Bill 4036 or the coal to renewables bill, vote for it. That's the one that will take those utility lines I showed you and bend them down under their trajectory. The Clean Power Plan, if it depends on the Congress, nothing's going to move. I don't know. I think it's probably inappropriate to write the Chief Justice, but maybe you do that anyway. But in the meantime, to the extent it's possible to support the big public policy movements, legislators and congressmen, you won't believe it. You think you're just one small voice in the wilderness. They listen, they count the letters, they count the emails. They especially count them if they're in your own voice and not a standard letter. I'm not kidding you. It really has an impact down in Salem. And this week, next week, sometime in the next couple of weeks is when it will really have an impact down there. So please do it.
I'm glad you said that, because I was actually going to say the same thing. You know, a handwritten letter or a typed letter makes a huge difference, and I hear this all the time from elected officials.
Yeah.
That they will, you know, all the form emails that could get to them are one thing, but when someone has taken the time to write out a considered, thoughtful letter on any issue, it's gonna rise to the top.
And if you can write a considered, thoughtful letter and keep it under one paragraph,
they really love that.
Just remember the Gettysburg Address. None of us write that efficiently, but that's what we should aspire to.
We're sort of out of time, and
Oh, good. House Bill HB 4036, or coal transition to renewables bill. They'll figure out what it is. It's a big deal.
so I moved to Portland 15 years ago, and I haven't had a car in 15 years. And the one thing you can do in this city is you can develop an entirely different relationship with your city when you walk everywhere. So that's just another thought. Anyway, let's give Angus Duncan a huge hand.